Volkswagen did not collapse suddenly, and it did not fail because of a single scandal, a single executive, or a single technical violation. What happened was the result of a decision that took shape gradually, long before the consequences became visible. And once that decision hardened into expectation, reversing it became increasingly dangerous. This story is not about deception at the beginning. It is about commitment, and about how commitment can turn into constraint. The company emerged in an environment where industrial survival depended on discipline, coordination, and scale. Volkswagen learned early that success did not come from experimentation or internal debate, but from delivering predictable outcomes under pressure. This shaped an internal logic where execution mattered more than questioning, and where stability was valued more than flexibility. These traits were not accidental. They were reinforced by circumstance, and they worked. As Volkswagen rebuilt and expanded, the organization became increasingly confident in this approach. It learned that central control, standardized processes, and strict adherence to targets could produce results at scale. Each successful cycle reinforced the same conclusion: the system itself was reliable. Over time, this belief became self-sustaining. Results justified the structure, and the structure justified itself. What appeared from the outside as resilience and competence was, on the inside, a growing dependence on habit. Volkswagen did not need to rethink its approach because there was no immediate reason to do so. Targets were met, markets were captured, and expansion followed. The absence of visible failure created the illusion that the organization had discovered a formula that no longer required revision. As the company grew into a global powerhouse, ambition grew alongside it. Volkswagen no longer aimed merely to compete within existing boundaries. It aimed to define the boundaries themselves. Market leadership stopped being an aspiration and became an expectation. Growth targets became public commitments, not internal estimates. At this point, ambition stopped being a direction and became a requirement. This is where the defining decision began to take shape. Volkswagen chose to prioritize dominance and credibility over internal uncertainty. Leadership committed to aggressive performance and regulatory goals, not as conditional objectives, but as outcomes that had to be delivered. Once those commitments were made publicly, they could no longer be treated as flexible or negotiable. Inside the organization, this changed how decisions were experienced. Targets no longer arrived as proposals to be evaluated. They arrived as conclusions that had already been reached. The role of the organization shifted accordingly. The question was no longer whether the goal was achievable within existing technical limits. The question became how disruption could be avoided while attempting to meet it. This distinction mattered more than it appeared, because once feasibility stopped being discussed openly, pressure no longer needed to be enforced explicitly. The system itself communicated expectations. Failure did not need to be threatened. It was already implied. Careers, credibility, and authority were now tied to outcomes that could not easily be questioned. At this stage, the decision that would later define Volkswagen's crisis was no longer a single choice made by a single person. It had become a structural commitment, a commitment to targets over feasibility, to momentum over revision, and once embedded, that commitment would shake every decision that followed. In many organizations, the pursuit of ambitious targets becomes more than just a goal. It transforms into the very ethos of the entity. These public commitments, often declared with great fanfare, set the tone for all subsequent operations. What began as mere aspirations designed to inspire and motivate gradually hardened into non-negotiable mandates. They were no longer suggestions for improvement, but absolute requirements for success. This intense pressure to achieve targets permeated every level of the organization, from the executive suite down to the front lines. No department or individual was exempt from its pervasive influence. Ultimately, this pressure fundamentally shaped the fabric of daily operations. It dictated priorities, influenced decision-making, and redefined what was considered acceptable performance. Engineers positioned closest to the technical realities of the work were often the first to experience growing limitations. They possessed an intimate understanding of the practical constraints involved. They frequently encountered physical constraints inherent in the hardware they were developing or utilizing. These were tangible barriers that could not be easily circumvented. Furthermore, they faced the increasing complexities of software development, where unforeseen interactions and dependencies could derail progress. The intricate nature of code presented its own set of formidable challenges. These inherent challenges of pushing boundaries were consistently present in their daily work. They were an undeniable part of the innovation process, demanding careful consideration. Crucially, these technical limitations were not always openly acknowledged or discussed within the broader organizational context. A disconnect often emerged between technical reality and aspirational goals. As information ascended the organizational hierarchy, it underwent a subtle but significant transformation. Its original form and intent were often altered. Raw data and unfiltered observations from the ground level were subject to refinement and interpretation. The objective was often to present a more palatable or optimistic picture. Initial warnings and critical insights, particularly those highlighting potential problems, were frequently filtered or reinterpreted. Their urgency or severity could be diminished. The emphasis gradually shifted from acknowledging potential problems to demonstrating progress and success. The narrative became one of overcoming obstacles rather than identifying them. Consequently, the focus moved from highlighting risks to showcasing perceived solutions, even if those solutions were incomplete or temporary. The goal was to maintain forward momentum. This transformation of information was a natural consequence of the prevailing incentive structures within the organization. These systems powerfully shaped behavior. The system consistently rewarded individuals who delivered results and met their assigned targets. Such achievements were often tied to promotions, bonuses, and recognition. It also favored those who consistently presented a positive outlook and projected confidence. Optimism, even when unfounded, was often seen as a leadership quality. Conversely, the system often punished those who raised concerns or questioned the feasibility of ambitious goals. Such actions could be perceived as negativity or resistance. Individuals who dared to suggest fundamental problems or systemic flaws frequently faced negative repercussions. Their careers could suffer, and their influence might diminish. Over time, silence became a rational and safe behavior within the organization. It was a learned response to the prevailing environment. Speaking up or voicing doubts, particularly about core objectives, carried significant career risks. It could mark an individual as a dissenter or a pessimist. Challenging the prevailing narrative could damage reputations and isolate individuals from their peers and superiors. Conformity offered a path of least resistance. Remaining silent, therefore, offered a degree of protection and allowed individuals to navigate their careers more securely. It was a pragmatic choice in a high-pressure environment. This adaptation to the environment was not a conspiracy or a deliberate act of deception. Instead, it was a gradual, almost unconscious process of behavioral adjustment. A paramount feeling of responsibility emerged to achieve the established goals, regardless of the obstacles. The targets became sacrosanct. Adaptation, even bending rules or stretching resources to meet targets, began to feel like the responsible course of action. It was seen as dedication to the mission. Escalation, pushing boundaries, and taking greater risks seemed the only path to success when faced with mounting pressure. Stagnation was not an option. Gradually, the organization's momentum began to replace critical judgment. The sheer force of forward movement overshadowed careful assessment. The focus shifted from assessing the situation objectively to maintaining the pace of progress at all costs. Speed became more important than scrutiny. The direction was no longer questioned. Ensuring the train stayed on track became paramount. The destination was fixed, and deviation was unthinkable. Eventually, the organization reached a critical juncture where stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. The inertia was too great to overcome. Admitting failure or acknowledging inherent limitations became too risky, both internally and externally. The potential fallout was immense. The risks of disruption from admitting unattainable targets had grown too great to contemplate. The consequences of stopping seemed catastrophic. The system, having adapted to the immense pressure and normalized silence, had reached a point of no return. Its trajectory was now fixed. Correction was no longer a viable option for the organization. The mechanisms for self-correction had atrophied under the weight of ambition. The precarious path forward, fraught with unacknowledged risks, was perceived as the only path that remained. All other options had been silently eliminated. From the inside, none of this felt dramatic. There was no single moment when the organization believed it had crossed a line. There were only repeated moments where alternatives felt more disruptive than continuation. This is the most dangerous condition for any large system. When stopping feels reckless and proceeding feels responsible, behavior becomes predictable long before consequences appear. When external scrutiny finally arrived, the shock was asymmetrical. The public experienced betrayal. Inside the organization, the experience was different. It felt like exposure rather than discovery. Volkswagen did not believe it had suddenly lost control. It believed that internal compromises had become visible to the outside world. As scrutiny intensified, responsibility fragmented rapidly. Executives pointed to process failures. Managers pointed to unrealistic demands. Engineers pointed to technical constraints. Each explanation contained truth, but none could fully account for the outcome on its own. The system had distributed responsibility so effectively that no single individual could fully explain or fully own what had happened. The public consequences were immediate and severe. Financial penalties followed. Reputation collapsed. Trust evaporated. But the deeper damage unfolded internally. The structure that had once protected the organization now stood revealed as a liability. The same hierarchy that enabled scale had suppressed correction. The same discipline that delivered results had silenced warnings. In response, Volkswagen announced transformation. New leadership was installed. New strategies were unveiled. New technologies were promoted as evidence of change. But structures do not change because intentions change. They change only when incentives change, and many of the underlying incentives remained intact. Hierarchy persisted. Consensus culture persisted. Risk aversion persisted. The organization attempted to reinvent itself while preserving the internal logic that had created the crisis. This produced tension rather than resolution. The company understood what had gone wrong, but understanding was not the same as capability. Volkswagen had been built to execute decisions, not to question them. It had been built to expand, not to retreat. It had been built to project certainty, not to admit limits. These traits did not disappear when the scandal ended. They remained embedded in processes, expectations, and behavior. The decision that broke Volkswagen was not illegal when it was made. It was strategic. It was rational. It was rewarded. Leadership chose dominance over dissent, targets over truth, and momentum over correction. Once that choice was embedded, failure became a matter of time, not intention. Volkswagen did not fall because it lacked intelligence or talent. It fell because its structure made honesty more dangerous than obedience. That is not a unique flaw. It is a systemic one. And systems built this way rarely fail suddenly. They fail quietly, then publicly, and then permanently.